Hello there, and welcome back to another episode of The Libertarian Listener with me, Chris Wilkinson. And in today's edition, I have the Libertarian Party UK Chairman and Mercia Regional Co-Ordinator, Dan Liddicott. Hello there.
Hi Chris, thanks for having me on your show.
If you want to see more of Dan as well, check out the British Bunker. There's a Facebook link in the description below. Is it a daily thing, by the way?
It's not quite daily. This is my opportunity to vent on a purely personal basis, where I can separate myself from all of my other obligations. And there you hear pure Dan speaking.
Right. The first news item of today's agenda is the fake news story regarding Donald Trump. Now, the media have been caught red-handed with their latest attempt at fake news. Media outlets have deliberately misinterpreted the words of President Trump at one of his daily press conferences to imply that he suggested people ought to inject themselves with disinfectant. PolitiFactors confirm that this is not true. In reality, he was firing suggestions at a medical advisor situated off-screen. And at least two media outlets, that is The Hill and the NBC in America, have both openly asserted that Trump said people ought to or could inject themselves with disinfectant, and many others may have rewritten their articles. Now, this is very clearly fake news. Is it worrying that people are so willing to believe what they're being told by the media, regardless of how true it is?
It is very worrying, and it's worrying for lots of reasons. The problem is people have reached a point where they mistake, and I quote Dr. Thomas Sowell quite a lot on this issue, where they have come to mistake their feelings for logical thinking. Dr. Thomas Sowell's well known for saying, the problem isn't that Johnny can't read. The problem isn't even that Johnny can't think. It's that he doesn't know what thinking is, and he mistakes feeling for thinking. And so people have an emotional response to Donald Trump rather than a logical one, and that blinds them to what's actually going on in front of their eyes. And so people very easily, and this is true on all sides, there isn't a single wing of politics that this isn't true for to some extent or another, that people will therefore believe an incorrect headline, repeat it as though that's true, and then later when they discover the facts don't match what they've just pounded the pulpit about, pride, whatever it is, kicks in, and they then find themselves trying to defend something that isn't true. And this is something we see a lot in politics today. And I think it's damaging to the whole political discourse because facts really matter. If this whole thing's going to be decided on an emotional knee-jerk reaction to someone that you don't happen to like, on what is the basis for selecting political leaders, on us approving their decisions, if we're not careful? And I keep saying we, which I'm hesitant to do as a libertarian, but so many individuals are willing to do that, and thereby they become a mob instead of free thinkers.
Well, the lockdown has been in place for 6 weeks now, and there are reports of more people breaking the social distancing rules, more traffic on the streets, although how they'd know that is rather suspicious, and many businesses are firing up again, ready to get back to work. Are people feeling fatigued by it all now?
I think that's definitely true. And I see it myself as I travel to and from work. I see there is much more traffic, even pedestrian traffic. But I wonder if what's really happening isn't that people are rebelling against lockdown. I think what they're coming to do is accept what lockdown really means. The panic job put on the public through various media sources and the repeated insistence on stay-at-home message at the beginning sort of hammered this particularly strict idea of lockdown into people's consciousness. And I think what people are doing now is realizing, there is actually more we're allowed to do within the rules than we thought. And because they're what I call uber strict fake lockdown, all right, which this bunch of really strict rules that almost imposed on themselves and each other via a very simplified version of the message, that they're realizing there's more nuance to it. And so I think people are reverting to proper lockdown as opposed to uber strict fake lockdown. The reason for that is because they just had enough. I think I read a report a couple of weeks ago where it came out that Cabinet was surprised at the effectiveness and, degree of instant obedience almost they got. They didn't expect nearly so many furloughed staff. Their predictions and calculations were based on a greater degree of dissent or lackadaisical attitude towards lockdown. They thought there would be more of that, and there wasn't. And people are now thinking, you know what? I am allowed to go to work if I can't work from home. I don't have to be a key worker to go to work if I can't work from home. I'm allowed to exercise. It doesn't have to be just 30 minutes a day. I can actually leave my house, because the message was, stay at home, stay at home, stay at home. But if you read the legislation and the guidelines, that wasn't it. That was a very simplified, very strict version of it.
Have you had any personal experience with any of the more fascistic lockdown adherents at all?
Thankfully not. I mean, where I live, people are very reasonable and amiable, and I have some wonderful neighbours. But, that's not to say people are breaking the rules, but they're not reporting on each other for non-crimes, if you see what I mean.
Mm.
People are very understanding and they're sensible. And if I come out of my house and someone's walking down the street, one or both of us will try and appropriately socially distance, and it's all very gentlemanly. So I'm grateful that I have managed to avoid that. But some particularly disturbing examples have come to the fore, through social media and the news media, which were very disappointing to me. But I was glad that there weren't so many, because you'd imagine that pretty much all the really worrying ones would have been reported on, because in this day of even proletariat level surveillance, we all carry a phone with a camera and we can record what we see. We would probably see most of it, I imagine. So I would say that relatively few state agents probably went beyond the mark, or we would have seen more of it.
Do you think that the lack of an exit strategy is a major worry, considering the number of state-induced crises that have now been manufactured? So increases in domestic violence, declining mental health, jobs being lost, businesses closing their doors, wealth being destroyed.
Yeah, and health being destroyed, because as well, people have not been presenting themselves to hospital for things that they ought, because they were trying to protect the NHS, and people who urgently need tests and diagnosing for various cancer-related things aren't being, because they're trying to protect the NHS. And so the lack of exit strategy is absolutely diabolical, because it's as though people are behaving like the only thing that can kill anyone at the moment is COVID-19. It's just not true. Lockdown kills people. Unemployment kills people. Inability to access your regular healthcare kills people. Poverty will kill people. Decline in the economy will kill people. And if it doesn't kill people, all of these things will certainly harm people. The real challenge is this, of course. Nobody knows how many, and they don't know how many people will be killed by COVID-19 either. And so I describe this when I'm talking to people as a real life example of the trolley problem. You've got a train coming down the track, and there's points on the track, and where the track splits into two, you've got people tied to the railway line. And in the trolley problem, the way it's traditionally presented, it's usually one person tied to one line and 10 people tied to the other line. And the conundrum is given, isn't it? You're the only person who has a chance to pull the lever and decide which track the train goes down. Which track would you send it down? And of course, 99% of people would say, well, send it down the track with only one person, because it's better that only one person die than 10 people die. But then people start to elaborate, well, what if the one person is, the inventor of a life-saving cancer treatment? What if the 10 people are all the worst criminals that you can think of? Does that change your decision? And so it's just a mental exercise for understanding what happens when you are urged to do something, but you don't actually know what the consequences of doing something are going to be. And that's what's happening now. That's the genuine situation we're in with COVID-19, which is that there is the urge and the clamour and, of course, the need to do something. The problem is nobody knows how many people will be hurt by doing the thing that we're doing compared to not doing it. And so it's like the trolley problem, except you don't know how many people are tied to each track. You're doing your best to try and work it out, but the train is still coming, and you're either going to pull the lever and choose which track it goes on, or you're not. And that's the problem government finds itself in. But I really think it's important that people don't oversimplify, and that they do understand that that is the reality. There isn't an everybody lives option. Whatever you do, people will be hurt by the action you take. And it's collectivism to say, let's only do it based on the numbers. Each number is an individual person with a life and people who love them and plans for their future. So if you say, I'm going to save all the people from COVID-19, you have to accept that you're going to hurt a lot of other people instead. The difference is you don't know their name or where they live or how you will hurt them. And so it's easy to ignore the fact, but we shouldn't ignore it. If we're going to make a sensible moral decision about how to deal with it, we have to accept the fact that there isn't a decision that can be made that doesn't hurt someone. So the real question is, who gets hurt and by who and why would you pick them? You just change who gets hurt. I mean, you're asking there about exit strategy. But I really think that when we understand the nuance of the problem, as I've explained it there, people will be more willing to accept the reality that whatever happens, people will die. And so we can now start to understand that COVID's not the only killer. Lockdown's a killer. We can then have a sensible conversation, debate about actually releasing lockdown. But as long as people think the only thing that hurts people is COVID-19, they'll be blind to the damage being done by lockdown.
It's certainly causing a lot of discontent in the Conservative Party ranks. I've got a quote from the Daily Mail here that says, Tory grandees urge Boris Johnson to ease coronavirus lockdown. 6 wealthy backers have demanded government fire back up the economy, and 3 cabinet ministers also broke ranks to undermine the lockdown strategy. Steve Morgan, the former boss of the house builder Redrow, told the Sunday Times, we're actually in danger that the medicine is more harmful than the cure, which is going back to what you've said there. I'm strongly in favour of getting the country back to work. This is not about profits. This is about saving the country from going bankrupt, from mass unemployment, from businesses going bust, people losing their livelihoods and homes. Surely events are going to overtake the government very soon. Do you think that a policy U-turn is just around the corner?
I certainly hope so, and I think it probably is. I'm of the opinion that, to some degree, the government was panicked into bringing in lockdown when and in the way it did. And that was a lot to do with the way public opinion was being formed and how that was being whipped up by the media. But as public opinion changes, government will find it easier to then relax lockdown. So this isn't a scientific-led decision, of course, at that point, is it? It's not a science-led one. It is a politics-led one. It's important, though, as I was saying before, that people do see the reality. And a lot of people will look at that list of names and they'll say that's money just, wanting to make a profit and they don't care about lives. But anyone who says that doesn't understand that there isn't an everybody lives option and that the state of the economy matters. And when it's bad, people die as a result. They have to understand. And it's difficult. I get it. People don't want to imagine that the action they are supporting might lead to someone's harm, but it is true that it will.
You're very right about the government's response not being scientific. We had mention last week of Professor Hennigan of Oxford University who said something completely contrary to the government strategy.
And even the scientists don't all agree. The science is not settled. Even with this, we should be more cautious about throwing all our eggs into one basket and putting up just one version of the science as the true one, because the whole point of the scientific method is that we are constantly learning.
The government said its approach has been consistent throughout the pandemic, and I think everybody knows that that isn't true. And they've decided that testing and potentially isolating people arriving in the country is now a sensible thing. I've got a quote from the Mirror here. Travellers entering the UK via British airports will be forced to quarantine for 2 weeks. Pressure has been growing on the government to enforce a stricter policy for travellers entering the country, following similar schemes in New Zealand, Australia and Germany. A government source told The Telegraph, we are looking to deploy these measures at the right time, in line with the scientific advice, and when community transmission has been significantly reduced. More than 15,000 people arrive in the UK each day from virus-hit countries, which obviously suggests that the need is now.
I mean, the need is now.
Yeah.
I mean, if you listen to, I think it was Chris Witty this evening, he was talking about the R factor and the importance of keeping it below 1, which he's quite right about. And people were asking, about, are we going to bring the schools back and all of this kind of thing? And he was very clear about the fact that keeping schools closed at the moment has an impact on reducing the R rate. And so one has to wonder then, with 15,000 people coming from virus-hit countries all the time and no testing and no quarantining of any kind happening at the moment, what impact that has on increasing the R, and whether the extent of our lockdown is what it is to balance that. And if it is, it's totally unacceptable. Mm-hmm. Absolutely unacceptable. We are living under and effectively an authoritarian regime. We believe it to be a benevolent one, but that doesn't stop it being authoritarian. It doesn't mean that our liberties aren't being infringed, because they objectively are. And if the reason for that is simply because they haven't got a decent strategy at airports and 15,000 people keep coming in from virus-hit countries, Are the rest of us the collateral to allow that to continue? Is that really the balancing act here? It's absolutely the wrong one, if so. It doesn't sound very libertarian, but there comes a point where you have to say, I'm sorry, if you're coming from X, Y, and Z place, you can't anymore for the time being. And if you come here at all, they're absolutely right at this point to start doing quarantine, but they should have started it before.
If we move it on to the UK high streets, obviously it's in a dire position as it is, what with the business rates. In the Telegraph, there's a quote here, the boss of Dixons Carphone has warned that some sales that have shifted online during the lockdown will never return to bricks and mortar stores as he prepares to reopen with extreme care. Alex Baldock said that the retailer has been pleased by the proportion of our store sales which have switched to online, and it's unrealistic to think those will all return to stores. Has the government literally been the bull in the china shop?
Yeah, I mean, people have tried to raise this as an impending recession, but it's not a recession. It's a deliberate shutdown of the economy. Now, you can argue about whether they were right to shut it down, but we can't debate whether that's what it is, because it is. They chose to shut it down. They deliberately said only these kinds of high street shops can be open, and the consequences will follow, for better or for worse. You might argue that online is the better model, and that really the high street is a dying business model. And the way people shop has always been heading in the direction that it is simply accelerated because of the crisis. And I think, there's probably a lot of truth in that. It doesn't help that it has been hamstrung by the way property and taxes and business rates and things like that work. And so we see the hand of the state in its demise in many places, and this is just one of them. I wouldn't necessarily suggest that we should try and save it through further state intervention. I'm more of a laissez-faire free marketer, and I think that people should make their choices and let businesses and services evolve to meet them.
Now, last week I mentioned that Sir Richard Branson had asked the government for £500 million of taxpayers' money to save Virgin Atlantic. And this week there's been a sequel, because Tata Steel has asked the government for exactly £500 million to save its UK operations. Now, this is a company that's been seeking government support for about 5 years now. What's your view on this?
There's probably a lot going on that many of us don't see in this regard. But the fact that it's been asking for this for 5 years suggests that it's not purely a COVID crisis, although it may be using the opportunity to try and secure what it's always been chasing. Well, let's first just state a principle that I do not believe in corporate welfare. If a business is failing, let's do a Dragon's Den impression. That's not a business, and I'm out. Do you know what I mean? And let it fail and let it be rebuilt by someone else who knows how to make it work. That's how it's supposed to happen. And the businesses which are not allowed to fail get called zombie businesses for a reason. They're constantly fed whatever they need just to keep them ticking over. And as with Tata Steel, the reason is, but there's 8,000 people employed here. It would be a terrible thing for them to lose their jobs. And they're absolutely right. It would. But I'm not sure what's worse, because those people the businesses would evolve, they would find other things to do, which were more sustainable, that didn't rely on taxpayer subsidy or being propped up. And so it's that short-term versus long-term view. And it's a challenge. Nobody wants to be put out of work. I don't want to be put out of work. And I hate to see people put out of work. But what value to keep it propped up? 500 million plus what the government's already borrowing or going to spend on the furlough scheme would chuck us right into a whole new realm of national debt. I think we're 1.8 trillion now. What does 500 million add to that? Probably a tiny drop in the ocean, but it's just lots of drops, isn't it? And this is not sustainable. But on the flip side, steel is an absolutely crucial industry. And so part of me says, well, if we are not making our own steel in this country, what do we do when we're in a position where we need it for strategic, perhaps even for defence reasons? I mean, I wrote about this because British steel was being looked at by China, wasn't it, at one point? Back in August last year, it looked like China might be the ones coming to rescue it. And at the time, I wrote about how that's sort of part of a 3-act play where China floods the market with cheap steel, undercuts Western producers who are regulating themselves into oblivion, Act 2, Chinese giants buy up Western producers that are struggling to compete. And in the third act, free Western nations wake up to realize that core strategic industries are now controlled by corporations owned by or loyal to a government that's the ideological opposite of the free West. We have to look at the steel problem in that light too. And we can't necessarily expect that we will have world peace forever. We may find that steel is absolutely strategic. So then we have to have a very difficult conversation about, well, how do we keep it going when it's not profitable? But you have to understand it's not profitable in the scheme of economic warfare strategies from countries with lower standards and lower pay. There might be a case for rescuing it in that regard. Not very libertarian, but if you find yourself without the means to produce the means of your defence and all of that kind of thing, because steel is absolutely critical, that could be worse.
Last week saw an historic event in the world economy. For the first time ever, the oil price had turned negative as buyers ran out of storage space to take on new stockpiles. In the short term, this is going to mean cheaper fuel, but job losses and higher taxes to compensate in the medium to long term. Will the decline prompt people towards more renewable alternatives, or will oil die another day?
That's a really good one. The climate change lobby have been pushing to get rid of it for a long time, and obviously they're pushing towards electric and other means. But, people are interested in the environment and really know what they're talking about, understand that electric, as it currently exists, is not a viable alternative because it is equally ecologically damaging. It may not be gas pollution, but it's other kinds. I think oil is going to be with us for a little bit. There is a war against it, an ideological one, and one that is being bought into more and more at the political legislation level. I think if people think that oil is strategically important as far as liberty and other things are concerned, they're going to have to make their voices heard. But I think a lot of people don't comprehend it. They buy what's available and they use it. Maybe I'm seeing bogeymen where there aren't any, but my gut feeling is the nature of oil as a fuel, its portability, the power it offers, all of those things tend towards a greater degree of individual freedom. Let's say we all go electric, then you're limited on miles, you're limited on where do you plug in, and so many things that can be regulated or controlled you're now suddenly absolutely dependent on, compared to the portability and power of oil-based engines.
Right, so in your view, what makes the Libertarian Party different from any other? What's its unique selling point?
I think what makes the Libertarian Party unique is that it truly does offer something as an alternative to all the mainstream parties. I suppose what people see when they see the mainstream is your standard left-right dichotomy, which is becoming increasingly blurred. When you think back to the election in December and you watch the Tories shamefully get into a bidding war on public spending with Labour, you realise that we're really looking at two centre-left parties now. With the Labour Party stretching even further left, or at least it did until Jeremy stood down. But it's becoming more and more obvious that there isn't a choice in politics. You can choose your party, but you can't choose the politics. And so what the Libertarian Party does, it offers something that's truly unique in that it really is trying to shrink the size of government. It really is trying to spend less as government. It really is trying to remove power from Westminster and bring it closer to the people where it belongs. And I believe there are three refreshing, genuinely unique propositions that no one else is offering.
Reminds me of that quote by George Orwell that says the real battle is between authoritarians and libertarians in that sense.
Yeah, I was going to say, and that absolutely is the battle. And unfortunately, we've been distracted so long by the idea that it's a battle between left and right that we get to the point where we're duped into choosing one of the two same options all the time. And the real battle, is between authoritarianism and libertarianism, or to put it another way, it's the state versus you.
What would your advice be to people who are new to the party looking to get involved?
You won't find that everything's laid out for you on a platter. And so it is about personal responsibility. If you want to get involved, then expect to be involved and to be campaigning at the grassroots as well as anyone else. Because as a small party, we really are building from the ground up. Now, that could be seen as a good thing, of course. If someone wants to get involved, they know they matter. They're not a number. They're not someone who's going to be pushed to one side and expected to rock up in all weathers during election season just doing leafleting. There's real opportunity to make a difference and see the difference you make in our party, partly because it's small, but partly because it's also localized. So for someone who's new to the party who wants to get involved, don't delay. Get in touch with your regional coordinator or your county group leader, introduce yourself, and there are opportunities that are only limited by your imagination.
You never know, they might be working on their own version of the Mercia manual.
They might, because you yourself are obviously heavily involved in how the Mercia region of the party is progressing its marketing and campaigning plans. But that is something that you were able to sort of bring to the table. You saw an opportunity, you had the energy to want to lead it, and the opportunity therefore was there. And so we are looking for people who are willing to sort of get involved at all levels. There are people who can join in projects that already exist, and there's room for people who want to start a new project.
Do you have any recommendations for introductory texts?
Oh, where do I start? I mean, there are literally hundreds and hundreds. I'll start with the one that has probably been most influential on myself. It's not necessarily the one everyone picks. All libertarians are different, and that's kind of the thing. Different things will trigger different people in their journey towards individual liberty. But for me, a significant factor in that was Bastiat's essay, The Law. He could have written it yesterday, even though it was written in the 1800s. In the way he describes how government's true purpose, which should be to defend individual rights, has been usurped and now actually violates individual rights on a regular basis. I think if you want to just see a relatively straightforward expose on how government is the exact opposite of what it's supposed to be, start with Bastiat's The Law, and from there you will reject the status quo before you're halfway through.
Do you think that as a result of the recent events, the pandemic, Brexit, constitutional crisis, more people are open to exploring libertarian ideas and possibly joining the Libertarian Party?
I do believe that the experience, the taster of lockdown, has really made the idea of authoritarianism real to people for whom it was only theoretical before. We have this idea, and Philip Pullman discusses it in a wonderful essay he wrote called Malevolent Voices That Despise Your Freedoms. In that essay, he explores the idea that people in the UK still believe that they're in a free country, and he demonstrates that they are not. And as well as listing all kinds of legislation that demonstrates that we're not, he sort of explores the hidden voice behind the facade that whispers to try and keep us asleep, to make us think that we still have the freedoms that we used to have, because this is England, and we're a free country, and those things can't happen here. They might happen in Nazi Germany and the other side of the Iron Curtain and, in North Korea or whatever, but here we're different. And in a very sort of chilling but also very eloquent way, Philip Pullman sort of exposes it. And I think the experience of lockdown has caused a lot of people to ask questions. People are questioning that government is not always right. It's very important that people ask that question and that they do it more often. Government needs to know that we are interested in our liberties, and it can only know that if we challenge when they take them away.
What do you think the prospects are for the party as a whole over this decade?
I'm very optimistic about the prospects for the party. I wrote a article for the party website a little while ago. It was a response to a City AM article where the question was posed, is the British political landscape right for a new centre party or something like that? And I was arguing that we are that new centre party, but not centre in the traditional sense, because we're not balanced between left and right. We are above left and right, but we are between them too. And the thing that we have to bear in mind as a Libertarian Party is that we are still very young. And so what we've achieved so far is barely out the starting blocks. We literally have everything in front of us, and that's something to be incredibly optimistic about. When I think about the Tories, they've been around for nearly 200 years. Labour are probably about celebrating their century. And the Lib Dems, evolved from the Whigs, went through a few different evolutions and incarnations, but have completely lost their way in terms of the word liberal. But we are the new blood. The elder statesmen of the 200 and 100-year-old parties, their time is coming to an end. People vote for them out of habit or tradition, but what do they mean anymore? Like I mentioned before, the December election, you could hardly tell the difference between the Tories and maybe, it's like that George Orwell Animal Farm moment where, the animals looked from the pigs to the farmers and from the farmers to the pigs, and they couldn't tell the difference. And when you look at everything that's going on during this COVID crisis, and you realise that the Tories will never be a small government party, they will never be fiscally conservative again. So you've got a choice of two left-wing parties. And that was always the trap that was coming all along. And so the Libertarian Party has this opportunity to say, we are different in a very real way. We have the opportunity to break the mold. That was the point I was making in my article. We are the peaceful revolution that really understands the correct origins of power, that really understands the need to defend individual freedom, that really understands the need to protect the smallest minority of all, which is the individual, and understands that the dampening effect of big government and the liberating effect of the small one. And to that degree, we are absolutely, totally different. If we can just get our message out there and in front of enough people, I believe they will see it. And the renaissance of politics in this country will not be a revival of left and right. It will be a revival of the love of individual liberty.
Well, on that note, that's a wrap for this episode. Hope you've enjoyed being on there.
Thanks. Pleasure. Anytime.
Right. Well, it's been fantastic talking to you, and I hope you join us again for the next edition of the Libertarian Listener sometime soon.